Steve Suarez, and I'm the Global Head of Innovation for both Finance and Risk. I'm delighted to be joined by a distinguished panel today to talk about future cities. We will start off with our keynote speaker, Greg Clark, who is the Global Head of Future Cities and New Industries for HSBC. We're also going to be joined by Hayleigh Ford, Alan Smith, Richard O'Connor, which I'll ask them very quickly if they can introduce themselves.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be joining the panel today. My name is Hayleigh Ford, so I head regional marketing for the wholesale business in the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. Over to Alan.
Hi, yeah, I'm Alan Smith. I'm Senior Advisor, Climate and ESG Risk Management here in Group, and so much about climate change has to deal with cities, so it's a real pleasure and privilege to be here.
I'm Richard O'Connor, Global Head of Investor Relations, and I obviously cover the investors in HSBC, and they are clustered in all the major cities all around the world. So clearly, when we're looking at investor trends, we're very interested in this topic in terms of future trends and future cities, and so where our investors reside and where they invest.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Hayleigh, Alan, and Richard. Today's session is going to be interactive, so I can ask everybody to please use the Q&A functionality. I can see that we already have over more than 1,000 participants joining us. So send in your questions, and we'll go ahead and we'll do our best to get through a lot of the questions. I do have a list of questions that I'll be asking our panelists, and we'll be going through that. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our keynote speaker. Greg, would you mind kicking us off?
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. And Steve, thank you very much for convening and hosting this event today. And thank you also to my colleagues who've joined us on the panel. I see today as a really important opportunity to try to ask and answer some significant questions about the future of cities that the pandemic has really been, as it were, proposing and underlining. In particular, I think we should ask the question, are we heading for continued urbanization, or are we going to see some changes happening here? When we think about the context of the pandemic, we can see that we were already entering the 5th decade of the century of the city. You can see the arc of urban population in the top left-hand corner here, and see that we're on a journey to 80% of the world's population being urbanized by 2080, from 40% in 1980. So a doubling of the percentage in this 100-year period. And we can also see that we've begun to understand what are the dividends that cities bring in productivity, in environmental efficiency, in social mobility and poverty reduction, in trade and in infrastructure. But it's also very clear that our century of cities has served up so far both examples of bad urbanization, where the pace of population growth has outstripped the carrying capacity of cities, but also the promise, if you like, of good urbanization, where innovation, leadership, investment, and planning come together to create cities that are able to adjust, not just to population change, but to climate change and industrial change as well. Now, this century was already producing a new network of global cities, and I'm grateful to our friends at Jones Lang LaSalle who put together this report that explains how, during the last couple of decades, we've moved to having many more cities that are part of the global network of trade and interaction and exchange. We've got cities playing much more distinctive roles than they used to play, new niches, new success models, and not every city is in competition with every other city. And you can begin to see here some very important regional variations. As Africa reaches 43% urbanized, it begins to produce cities that are networked into this map. North America at 82% urbanized already has the most mature system and is likely, of course, to have a different relationship with its cities going forward. Now, we asked you the question about COVID-19 and asked you, what do you think that COVID-19 will be seen as in 10 years' time? And what was interesting was that you all thought it would be an accelerator of technology in various ways. Over 25% of you voted for that. And people also thought that COVID-19 would trigger social and geographic change and would be recognized as having been, of course, a health pandemic primarily. Now, when we looked at this question of what would happen as a result of COVID-19 last year, we came up with this fairly simple formula. On the one hand, we said that there are clearly going to be different phases to the pandemic. There'll be a recovery phase as well as a reset phase, and it would be wrong to extrapolate from one to another. We said there are significant shifts happening because of the pandemic in trade and supply systems, a rapid uptick in digitization, a renewed priority for health, particularly healthy spaces, healthy places, healthy transport, a new focus from all of this on the future of the planet, changed relationships between citizens and governments, and the possibility of a new kind of social contract. But all of these changes have very big implications for population settlement and for job locations. They have big effects on all kinds of places, cities and districts and regions, but they also impact, very interestingly, on services and systems of one kind or another. And many of those changes are the things we're going to talk about today. It's important perhaps, though, to put this in the context of recognizing there are some important regional variables. One of those, of course, is the level of urbanization that's already existing. Others are to do with specificities of particular locations. There's dynamics of competition between cities being played out here. And of course, there's the pursuit of innovation to create greater agility in our cities as we move forward. So it's important to note that these changes are not going to be evenly dispersed. There's no zero sum and there's no aggregate effect, I would suggest. Now, we also asked you the question, how many of the changes that you've made during the pandemic management period do you think you will carry through into whatever is the next cycle? And interestingly, a very large number of you said, nearly 50% of you said, half of the changes that you've made in your lives will carry through. You can see it's a very even curve as well. So it's clear that many of us have made changes in the way we work, the way we live, the way we travel, and those will now become part of a new cycle which will affect the shape of our cities into the future. We also asked you what you think will happen to global urbanization as a consequence of the pandemic. And it was interesting that only 20% of you thought that global urbanization might increase, but that's quite a significant number. 30% suggested a decline, but many more of you, almost half of you, said that the global urbanization process will continue, but it will change its shape and its size. Our cities will begin to look and feel different. So what kinds of shapes and sizes might our cities have in the future? Well, last year we looked at this question and tried to form an answer to the idea that our cities are becoming much more digitized, giving them opportunities for all sorts of innovation they didn't have before. And yet at the same time, the appeal of the physical assets and what we call the face-to-face and the face-to-place functions of cities still seem to be important. So rather than thinking of this as a kind of journey from the physical city to the virtual city, we started to think of it as being the creation of a new idea, a kind of blended city, a city where people can make different choices about where they live, how they work and consume, and when and how they travel. Where cities, if you like, have to make new choices of their own about where to innovate with public space, with mobility systems, with housing markets and labor markets, how to create a city that is organized much more around this hybrid blended world, how to generate revenues in this context, and of course, which economic sectors to pursue. So we began to see, looking at this, that if you like, what the pandemic has done is to accelerate this idea of a blended city, a city that is both virtual and physical at the same time. Now, underpinning all of this, of course, is that cities need to embrace climate change, and not just because cities are impacted by climate change, but also because they're producers of carbon emissions. You can see here on this chart the 500 cities that are vulnerable to a half-meter rise in sea levels that would occur if we exceeded the 2 degrees of global warming agreed in Paris. And for this reason, the pandemic is a key accelerator of city initiatives to decarbonize, to create cities that are at once cleaner, better connected and more compact, using different urban forms to create less carbon intensity to the way people live and work around the city. And you can also see here that cities playing a key role in seeking to change, to influence and to shape citizen behavior. All of this increasing very rapidly, and I'm grateful to the Coalition for Urban Transitions for the chart here that explains so well how the zero carbon city strategy emerges. Now, underpinning all of this, of course, is the new generation of technologies. And cities are using these technologies essentially to innovate in three important ways. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we can see that cities are using these technologies to shape their city systems, to make them more efficient, more anticipatory, more intelligent, more integrated, and more interoperable. At the same time, on the right-hand side, cities are hosting the new sectors that grow up around these technologies. Cities, if you like, have become the place for innovation. So many city centers switching towards innovation activity. And thirdly, of course, cities are increasingly using digital platforms, not just to create virtual transactions, but to reinforce ideas of place as well. Now, we asked you, do we still need offices? And you voted on this very clearly. Nearly 50% of you said, yes, we do still need offices, and over 30% of you said, maybe we do. So we asked you, why do we need offices? And interestingly, nearly all of you who voted in large numbers here, offering several different thoughts about this. Many of you voted for collaborative creativity and innovation as the key driver of the future of offices, social and mental health as another one, and a place to work, especially for people who don't like or can't easily work at home. So a strong majority of you thinking that we do need offices and that we will, as it were, have good reasons to remake our offices into the future. Now, when we look at the future of offices and of CBDs, we can see, of course, that city centres are going to have to re-engineer themselves as a result of the pandemic. There will be fewer aggregate numbers of people going to work in cities, fewer people shopping in cities. But there are many opportunities here for cities to innovate with the things that they do and to try to maintain this complex, rich mix of activities, which, as you can see, is really being pursued now by businesses very directly in creating new kinds of offices. I'm grateful to the Maury Memorial Foundation for telling us something about what they think the important cities of the world will be after the pandemic. This is their Global City Power Index, published in December 2020, where they begin to show the cities that they think are significant for the future. And what's interesting looking at this chart compared to what it said 20 years ago is that so many of the significant cities that they're now looking at are in Asia and, of course, in the Middle East. So we asked you the question, have you thought about becoming more mobile as a result of COVID-19? Has the pandemic changed the way you feel about home and place? 65% of you said you weren't thinking of moving house as a consequence of COVID-19, but just over 22% of you said you were. And I think that's very significant given how much increased mobility is creating and now shaping people's lives, especially in the sectors who employ the people who are likely to be here on this call. Our colleague James Pomeroy from Global Research this week published a very interesting report that looked at cities and inflation and picked up on the downturn in housing markets in cities since the pandemic. And James made the interesting insight, of course, that at the moment people are able to leave cities, but traditionally, of course, the people who come to cities are often people who've crossed borders to do so. So there may be a lot of pent-up demand for population in our cities in the future. But to draw this to a quick close, what the pandemic has done is to ask some new questions about how our cities work. It's presented, I think, some new mantras. Cities need to be more agile. They need to focus on making the most of hybridity. We need to move towards the city as a service. To do that, cities will need to reform certain things that are already happening. Consumption will change. Our approach to leisure and to work, as we've seen, will change. But I think there are opportunities for cities in all of this to develop their roles both as healthy places that offer a good habitat for people, to use innovation to drive forward new ways of thinking about place and space and services and mobility and the other aspects and assets of the city. And also to focus much more, not so much on the consumption agenda, but on the experience that goes with it, trying to create more vital cities that will be exciting for people to go to in the future. So it's been a pleasure to go through these ideas about the future of the city and the impact of the pandemic with you this morning. And I'm looking forward to the conversation that we will now have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg, and obviously very insightful as always. I always love hearing you speak, and great to hear that innovation is going to be key part of where we're going from a future cities perspective. Now I'm going to go ahead and go to the panel. As part of what Greg was talking about is we went out, did a survey, and we had a good number of people that had responded to us. And one of the survey results that stuck out for me, and again, this is I'm going to open it up to the panel, was that 50% of the people that responded said that future cities will be less vibrant as a result of the pandemic. And another stat was that 49% of the people said that they would be moving out of bigger cities over the next 5 years. Any comments or anybody want to chime in on any of those stats?
I think, Steve, it's not surprising, but I think we need to probe beyond it. I think obviously a shock that has a pandemic and is COVID will make us reflect what we think the cities are. My sense is that less vibrant, no. Cities have a really powerful way of recreating themselves. If you think of London and where we are, kind of it burnt down, it's had its pandemics in the past. And actually, even when I came to London 35 years ago from Barbados, there were still bits of London which had bombed out places from World War II. And where I couldn't go east of Blackfriars Bridge on the south side of London. And now that whole part there is one of the most vibrant bits of London. So I think, yes, we have and are still going through this tremendous shock that has the pandemic. But my sense is that it will recreate itself in a vibrant way. And that doesn't just apply to London. I think it will apply to a number of other cities as well.
Thank you, Alan.
I've not much to add to Alan. I completely agree. I don't 100% agree with the Goldman Sachs CEO the other day, who basically said that this will be seen as an event which we'll forget very quickly and go back to the old ways. But no, I agree with that. Cities, particularly the big cities which Greg talked about, have a way of reinventing themselves, and I think you'll see a reinvention of the city, and they'll be as vibrant in the future as they have been in the past.
Yeah, I think the identities of cities, particularly as they come back online around big moments like COP26, we're going to have Davos and Singapore Expo here as well. It will really be brand Dubai or brand Glasgow, and also how the brands of different cities that are interconnected show up post-COVID.
Great, thank you. Greg, any final thoughts on that before I move on to some more questions?
Well, I suppose the key thing to say, Steve, is that I don't think all cities will recover in the same way. And I think that part of the key here is going to be how innovative they are, how much they pursue new ways of doing things, and particularly how they re-engage citizens who will be very wary of a full throttle sort of return to cities unless we can really work on the communication around health and excitement and what makes the city, really worth visiting. I think there's going to have to be some proactivity there.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. Richard, I'm going to go to you. My first question for you is, have you seen any changes in the investment patterns as a result of the pandemic? And how will investments change going forward because of it?
Thank you, Steve. And the two aspects of that question. The first one, pretty simple. As per all of us, we've moved very quickly onto Zoom for investor meetings rather than face-to-face. And going back to face-to-face meetings will happen over time, but there'll be a combination of video and face-to-face meetings. Interestingly, when you poll investors, they still value face-to-face contact, and actually for them to make active decisions, i.e. buying or selling shares, does require that face-to-face interaction, and we'll see it with our clients across the bank as well. In terms of the development of the investor base, and I've been in investor relations over 20 years, we have seen what you call as the clustering effect, i.e. it's a specialist industry and it's clustering into what Greg calls the big 7 cities of the world, so the Londons, the Hong Kongs, etc. And that's moving. So I've gone to many, many mid-sized US cities over my career. Unfortunately, the investors are moving away from those into the big cities such as New York. And in the East, you are seeing a huge clustering impact in areas like Singapore and Hong Kong, and in China in what are called the tier 1 cities, the big 4 tier 1s. So that's basically Shanghai, Guangzhou, Shenzhen. And so we're concentrating our efforts into those big cities, and in both in the East and the West. And in Hong Kong, we're seeing literally dozens of investment firms setting up from mainland China into Hong Kong, and that's a great development to see. In terms of HSBC, we're also seeing huge focus of investment into wealth, into the Greater Bay Area, into those 4 tier 1 cities and Hong Kong. And indeed, we took investors there into the Greater Bay Area from Hong Kong just a year or so ago to show the huge growth there and the huge focus of HSBC and our investment into those big tier 1 cities, the cities of the future. And that's something which will be a big theme of our investor communication over the coming years.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. Appreciate that. Alan, I'm going to come to you now from an ESG perspective. There's a link between human health and the planet's health. And obviously through the pandemic, there's been a reduction in pollution in our cities. Maybe the first question to you is, do you think that we're going to be able to maintain that? And then the second question is more about Bill Gates's new book on climate change. And one of the quotes that I read in the New York Times that I found fascinating was that he had said, we're going to solve climate change not through planting trees, but through innovation, which is very exciting, especially, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. So can you give us your thoughts on that?
Of course, thanks, Steve. And actually, they're interrelated. The fact that we aren't traveling as much and in the same way has cut down pollution, and actually we have to maintain that. If collectively as a country, as a society, we need to get to our net zero commitments by the end of 2050. So almost that has been one of the, I hate to use the word silver lining in COVID, given how tough a time it has been, but at least it's given us that catalyst to realize what we need to do to get to a net zero world. And cities have to be at the center of that. Greg alluded earlier in the central role that cities play, and we do that in a number of ways. How we plan our cities, how we kind of use energy and electricity, how we do existing buildings, how we do new buildings, how we do public transport, how we personally use our own transport, how we handle waste. All of those are essential to climate change. And to your point, innovation is at the heart of it. Because there's something very critical about the way in which cities lead on innovation, the ways in which cities help drive ideas that are essential to that climate change solution that we must get, and our central roles that we in cities play. To Bill Gates's point, I was going to be naughty and say planting trees is innovation as well, Steve, and one of the easiest ones. So for someone like me who isn't a green thumb, he makes a really important point that some of the ways to deal with climate change are going to require new technologies to be developed, for example, around carbon capture and storage, okay, as one of them, or in ways which not only help design it, but also bring down the economic cost of that. But that is, so he's totally right. We have to be looking at that innovation, but also one of the important bits of carbon capture and storage is planting trees. I heard one of the most fascinating slogan. So in Sierra Leone, there's Freetown, and one of their ways of innovating to address climate change is actually rebuilding trees around Freetown. And the mayor of Freetown says she wants Freetown to become Tree Town. So yes, we'll have innovation and it's important, but the green and natural capital aspect of it is quite important.
Yes, thank you very much. Very good point. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and open it. Maybe Richard, I can come back to you. I'm starting to kind of get filtered out some questions. So how do we think the pandemic will impact future cities from a commercial and residential perspective?
I think residential, in terms of residential construction, I think there'll be growth outside the cities, and people will more easily leave an hour or two away from cities and they might go in a day or two. I think you're seeing that already. However, in terms of the big cities, you'll continue to see inward immigration into those cities by students and young people who will therefore still need the 1 and 2 bedroom flats. So I think you'll see both those cities, and you've seen that over the last decade. I think those trends will accelerate going forward, and therefore, in terms of commercial property, again, I think you need to worry a little bit about regional shopping centres and regional towns who don't have a strategy to really invest heavily in the high street and change high streets. I think the big cities such as London and Hong Kong, I think, will be absolutely fine. And as many of the panel have said, you'll see innovation and cities regenerating themselves for future use. So in the old days, you'd have hundreds of thousands of financial services staff. I think you will have much more agile, small technology firms, fintech firms, in terms of WeWork offices. So I think you'll see that innovation. So those will be the 2 trends I would foresee. But clearly, the rest of the panel, Hayleigh, Greg, and Alan, will have their own views as well.
Anybody want to add on to that?
Well, Steve, if I may, I think that one of the interesting things here will be the differences in different parts of the world. As I was trying to say a little bit in my remarks, places like North America already 82% urbanized, with it, as it were, not the strongest urban appetite, whereas I think in Europe, 79% urbanized. There's much more appetite for urban life. So there are, I think, some cultural variations, and there are going to be, I think, some variations depending on the degree of urbanization. I expect to see, continued urbanization in much of Asia Pacific, India, Middle East. And I think that some of the trends that we're observing here will be more muted there. But I completely agree with Richard's assessment that there will be some adjustments, I think, in residential markets, in office markets, and in retail. It's just that I wouldn't bet on the aggregate happening in every city. I think that each city is going to respond very, very differently. And, one of the unusual benefits of this big technology uptake is that some cities could actually become more dense, more vibrant, more active, because they can serve a resident population that's much further away. So you could actually increase the numbers of jobs in some cities. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
I think it goes back to your point about being more dynamic and what cities can attract those people and attract the talent and investment into those cities. So very good point. Thank you. So I'm going to move on to the next question. We've got hundreds of questions. So the next question is really about kind of where we work. Before the pandemic, your job was based on where they posted the job and where they were looking for people. Now, after the pandemic, it seems that maybe jobs can be a bit more location agnostic, if you will. I don't know, Greg, you want to kick us off, and maybe Hayleigh?
Well, I'll offer the quick thought, Steve, that I think it depends upon the sector that you're in. Some sectors are highly digitizable and can adopt a very high level of flexible working. Others are not. And so that's one obvious difference. So each city has a different sector mix. And then secondly, and I think importantly, increasingly the innovation economy is something that is really associated with urban locations. It's been interesting to see the transition from the science parks, as it were, to the inner city urban innovation districts. And I think increasingly there'll be a kind of switch here where certain kinds of jobs will move out of cities because they can, but that will create space for other jobs to move into cities. And I would suggest that the innovation economy will be the big growth area for jobs in the future. So it depends what sector you're in, whether you're going to get more flexibility out of this.
I mean, in the Middle East, we're certainly seeing government policy that supports that kind of innovation, urbanization, and Dubai, almost passporting jobs to Dubai, giving you visas, you can do your job from anywhere. So there's some really interesting, I guess, national pushes to both support job creation, but those innovation economies. And they're redrafting certain new districts to definitely support what Greg said, not just relying on tourism, big malls and real estate, as it were, before COVID.
Great.
And Steve, from my point, if I can put a reflection, 'cause I think you've touched on a profoundly important point. If I look at my role here at HSBC, the last number of bits have been global roles. I like to tell people that more people work for me while I'm asleep than while I'm awake. And people kind of say, Alan, that's because you sleep at your desk. Maybe not. It's because in a global world, a number of us have already been moving to a geographically agnostic way of working. I think though it does bring out, and Greg, you touched on it, there are haves and have-nots in that. And I think COVID has shone a light into the souls of cities, of those who have and those who have not. Because, and one of the really troubling things is actually we found out that the essential people in cities and the essential workers are those who keep the lights on. Actually, those who, when all of us have been at home doing our remote working, have literally, at the danger of their health, been traveling in. Someone told me, for example, that Canary Wharf during the pandemic has been majority Black, majority BAME.
Wow.
That if you were on those tubes going into Canary Wharf in the last couple of months, you'd have thought you're going into Lagos or Mumbai or Bridgetown, given the demographics. And I think we need to reflect on what that is telling us about our cities and where we go next as we recreate ourselves.
Wow, that's incredible. Good, Alan. I'm going to stick with you on a separate topic, and it's back to ESG. And a question came up about with everybody going to a net zero carbon, how do we make sure that these different initiatives around the world don't conflict with each other?
I think part of, and that is why, as Hayleigh was talking earlier about COP26 in Glasgow, where we're really making sure that we are aligning ourselves. I mean, one thing about the climate, none of us is entitled to our own science. The facts that's driving up the temperature is going to be driven by the same thing everywhere. So while climate impacts us differently because of maybe social class or ability to be resilient, the science is going to impact all of us. So that coordination is essential. And that's where something like COP later on in this year, where we're trying to get as much coordination as possible, is key. You know, we can't, it's too urgent an initiative for us to be going at cross purposes on things that we don't need to go at cross purposes on. But it's also where cities play such a leading role in doing that.
Great. Thank you, Alan. Greg, a question for yourself is, as a result of the pandemic, is any of the data showing, are people moving more towards the rural or more towards the bigger cities? I understand it depends on the different countries, but anything you can share as far as insight?
Well, Steve, there was a very interesting study that was published in the middle of last year by the OECD that looked at the future patterns of population settlement. And what it showed is that much of the urbanization that's going to happen in the next 2 decades is going to be in the smaller cities and towns that are connected to the larger ones. If you like, many of the larger cities have reached their natural size, and we're going to see much more of that. My sense is that what the data is showing us, and our colleagues in global research put together, as I said earlier, very interesting report that was published this week called Cities and Inflation, James Pomeroy and colleagues. Very good report. What it shows you is that the house price changes that are happening in our cities and cities versus rural areas and other areas, this is driving change. As people have the choice not to live as close to work as they had to when they were doing a daily commute, they are making some choices to move out. But as I said earlier, we're not yet clear how much of the international migration into cities will come back once borders are open and international travel is normalized. And I take Richard's point from earlier on, that probably, you know, that the data is going to show that there's a strong appetite for return. And so I think we have to wait about a year to see how, not the number of people leaving cities, but the number of people returning to cities. That will be the key question.
Excellent. Thank you. Richard, I'm going to come to you. I had a question, and I'm going to remove any specific politician's name to kind of protect the innocent here. But certain politicians believe that city centers will return back to normal like they used to be. Do you think that some of the politicians are prioritizing economic benefit over applying innovation to help their cities?
Yeah, yes and no. Obviously, I think they'd want both. I think they're being a bit naive by saying you're going to return back to 2019, because when you look at dislocations in the past, wars, fires, cities do change. And I think it's the role of politicians and obviously companies and society to innovate, to affect positive change in all respects, economically, obviously in terms of the environment. So I think the job for politicians is to A, do no harm, and obviously set the trend lines and the conditions for society to innovate and make our cities better in the future, and better places to live, work, and better for the climate. So I don't agree, but clearly politicians say many things, and you shouldn't believe all they say.
All right, thank you. I've got another question, kind of related, and I'm going to open it up to the panel, is around cross-border taxation, and how that blocks the ability to be location agnostic. Do we think that politics will change to accommodate this?
I'll kick off. No, obviously there is an issue with cross-border taxation, particularly for technology companies, and where they're located and where they pay tax, particularly in the US versus countries like Europe. That, I think, good news is that's, fingers crossed, over the next few months, looks like it's been resolved. I don't really see taxation as a particular barrier to firms locating where they think is the best locations for their operations. Clearly, it's just one issue, but I don't think it's an overriding issue versus all the other factors which companies and individuals make in terms of their decision making. But clearly, again, my comment on politicians, it's the role of governments and politicians to help affect positive change, and that would include taxation in all its aspects. So agreements on cross-border taxation and cooperation would obviously be good to help what we're all looking for.
Anybody want to add to that, or are we?
Steve, we might just make the obvious point that aside from cross-border taxation, the whole issue of how easily people can flow between cities is a really key point. You know, cities over history that succeed attract more population, and as they attract more population, they have opportunities to turn that into increased capacity and productivity. I think that one of the interesting things in the climate at the moment is how open borders will be for people that want to move between countries. That raises issues of taxation, but it's much more about how frictionless the borders are and which cities will benefit from that.
That's an excellent point, kind of coming back to Hayleigh's point about giving out visas and trying to attract. So maybe things will turn on its head to where it's about who we can attract and how many people we can attract instead of how do we keep people out. So definitely it will be interesting to look at that. Let me look through some more questions. And again, I'll open it up to the panel. What are the biggest commercial opportunities for HSBC arising from the changes in the next 10 years? I know that's a pretty broad question, but thinking about future cities and what are our opportunities in future cities over the next 10 years?
I think I'll let Greg answer this as well, but one of the things we found actually, and it's quite educational for our internal population, is future cities doesn't necessarily mean giga projects or infrastructure. It's actually about opportunities in the human, the virtual and the physical world, and actually how they will interplay. So our solutions will be much more multifaceted than I guess traditional lending or GB-led infrastructure when it comes to this this thematic. But yeah, if you think about the mobility of goods or the mobility of people, that speaks to kind of green trade, some of our kind of retail banking propositions, and I guess the mindsets of people to want to live and make choices around sustainable urbanism when it comes to their investments or their way of life.
Steve, maybe I should pick up quickly and simply say I think there are three big opportunities for HSBC here. The first one is obviously cities and climate change, where the driving of the sort of the net zero strategies in cities is a way of really building demand for green finance, for sustainable finance, and the many suites of things that we want to provide. And that's in the utilities, the systems, mobility sectors, and everyone else. The second one, of course, is the digital platforms and the opportunities that they provide for new kinds of urban innovation. And by that, I mean the ways in which cities organize themselves to really optimize space, resources, assets, systems, services, and other things, using digital platforms to make that possible. That gives rise to new business models, new operational models, and new financial requirements. So I think that's a second one. And then the third one, of course, is simply cross-border businesses. I mean, cities are the places that anchor the cross-border businesses. That's why HSBC has such a big concentration of activity in about 20, 30 cities around the world. The opportunity, I think, with many of the new agreements that are being struck is for more of our cities to be producers of cross-border activity and therefore to be involved in cross-border investment, trade, joint ventures and other things. So I think all of those are the core areas that I would look at.
I would just add one other, I mentioned earlier, which is our wealth investment in China, but also other cities around Asia elsewhere. Clearly, our competitors, the large Chinese companies and the insurance companies, have hundreds of thousands of agents selling product in China. We couldn't afford to do the same. However, with our Pinnacle venture, we can hire a few thousand sort of account relationship managers, wealth planners, and use the digital technology which Greg mentioned in about 9 or 10 key cities, the growth cities of China in the future, in the Greater Bay Area and elsewhere. So that's an opportunity which you may not have had 5 or 10 years ago because of the requirement to hire hundreds of thousands of people. We think we can make a very solid growth business with a fair amount of investment using digital trends and the trends in those future cities.
And Steve, one on I would add on, it kind of flows from what Hayleigh, Greg, and Richard have said. Infrastructure, in particular, one of the key things, in particular, climate resilient infrastructure. And actually, there are 2 big initiatives that the group are part of on the climate initiative: Fast Infra and also the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. But the rebuilding of infrastructure, a lot of it which will be focused on cities, is a big opportunity. And also, coming back into this whole issue of inclusion and inequality, one of the most powerful ways of addressing inequality and those who are vulnerable are by building resilient infrastructure and making it available for a wider cross section of people. So it's an area where it's not just the business opportunity, but the ability to have an impact as well.
Excellent. And I could tell you, we got so many questions, and I know we won't be able to get nearly through probably half the ones that have been asked. I'm going to end with one last question, which I actually found interesting. All of our conversation is concentrated about future cities. What about rural areas? Any comments on rural areas?
I'm so glad you asked that, because for cities to be healthy, our rural areas need to be healthy. And we need to have that contact. It was funny, we've been talking about global cities, and again, a politician, and I won't mention their name, said, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. And that brings out the way in which we in our global worlds become disconnected with our rural areas. Rural areas, cities cannot grow at the expense of rural areas, or indeed a big city like London cannot grow at the expense of the rest of the country, or else we get some of the dislocation and stuff that we've seen recently. So thanks, that is a very powerful question. We will be as strong as our rural areas are as, cities.
Steve, if I could add to that, I mean, clearly there's no accident that we're talking about cities. These are the big population centers. They're the big systems and platforms for trade and enterprise. And of course, they're the places that provide the systems and the services for large parts of our population. So it's important to think about cities. But cities are, as Alan says, interdependent with rural areas. And one of the interesting things that's come out of the pandemic, I would say, is that, of course, there are opportunities for some people to move back to the countryside. And you will see, I think, some repopulation of rural areas, helping them, we hope, to create a critical mass of population to support the amenities and services that people need. Because the problem for rural areas is that if people move to the city, sometimes the areas, the neighborhoods, the communities become unviable. So that's one, as it were, opportunity from this. The other one, of course, is that cities have become aware that they need to integrate rural functions into the city. So this means particularly things like urban farming, the ability of cities to grow their own food and to become more self-sustainable in terms of food. Obviously not totally quickly, but there's a lot of innovation in that space around urban food and urban water, which I think will be an important part of the agenda going forward.
Yeah, I think biodiversity is a part of that as well, Greg, mangroves in Abu Dhabi, forests in Australia. There's going to be a massive interplay around rural to urban biodiversity.
And nature solutions in cities will be a big focus, I think, in the next cycle.
I've been asked to have one last question, and I'll promise this will be the last, and it's around the obligation of society we make profit to be in employers in that location. Sorry, and do we think that we have an obligation to society in which we make profit to be the employers in that location? I don't know if anybody wants to take that, or
perhaps a quick comment, Steve, is that I think that what the pandemic does is to ask questions about our social contract, as I was saying. And part of the social contract is that, that broader societal agreement about what we do together, what freedoms we allow to one another to do things differently, and where we create and how we look after our public goods. And I think that one of the things that's become very clear is that, as Alan said, I think correctly, the pandemic has been a kind of microscope or a magnifying glass on our societies. It's revealed a lot of challenges. And I think that part of what comes next is a new license to operate for business that will include, I think, much more social responsibility at a place-based level. So that could be in cities, it could be in coastal or rural areas indeed. But I think place-based responsibilities will be a key part.
excellent. And I think we're going to go ahead and end on that, just because from a timing. So number one, I'd like a big thank you to you, Greg, Hayleigh, Alan, and Richard. I appreciate you guys sharing your insight with us. Big thank you to Catherine Coffey and Hannah Gedge for helping us organize all the behind the scenes on this, a lot of work. And thank you to our audience to chime in and ask some excellent questions. We will be recording this session, so we will make it available to you. And we look forward to having another one of these, hopefully in the next quarter, so that we can continue on this conversation. Big thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks. A real pleasure.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.